So we're going to get right into it. So some of my experience, I've held active shooter drills and exercises for colleges and universities and companies and government organizations as well. I've also, on my other side, my volunteer work is with a foundation called the New York Says Thank You Foundation. And we go around helping survivors heal after disasters. We help rebuild, but we also help the communities rebuild emotionally. I'll tell you a little bit about how that works and how we got involved with active shooter incidents specifically on that level. I'm currently working with the San Bernardino survivors as their volunteer advocate to be able to recount the stories and what they've been going through since that shooting occurred a year and a half ago, to be able to hopefully then share with our profession of emergency managers around the world to look at the lessons learned from the survivor's perspective and from the victim's family's perspective. So I'm going to share some of those with you as well today. Some of the findings that I've learned after meeting with and sitting down with dozens of the people who are in the room today. First, let's talk about terrorism for a second, but we're going to focus on active shooter today. But I just want to mention, of course, now we know it can happen here. And everybody did hear around the world about what happened in Edmonton. And then unfortunately, right afterwards, we saw what happened in Vegas. But I just wanted to, I'm not going to go on about this, but obviously this shows us that these kinds of things are here now and can happen here. So it's really important for us to ensure that we have the proper plans in place to know that we could respond if something like that did happen near our area, affected our business, or affected our community. Now we'll get into the active shooter specifically. And like I said, it can happen anywhere in the world, but also any location. And we're seeing that. I have to give you examples almost every week, unfortunately. We've seen different examples of either terror attacks, mass attacks, or active shooter attacks happening in different locations. It used to be assumed that these active shooter attacks mostly happen in schools, or otherwise mostly happen in office buildings. But as you can see, and as we have witnessed, now they are starting to happen in open areas in different places. We know that we recently had an attack in Quebec City, which is classified as an active shooter attack as well. We had an active shooter attack in Laval, Saskatchewan last year. So they're here, they're all around us. Just to touch on, if you hear about the terminology active intruder versus active shooter, sometimes I'll use the terminology active intruder because that encompasses more than just somebody with a gun. Because now we see as well, people are using other types of weapons to be able to attack large groups of people. And these are just some examples of them. Here's the active shooter definition, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. In the US, I can tell you that how they define an active shooter incident, because almost every day or every week, there is an event going on, a shooter event going on in the US, but you don't really see coverage of them until there have been at least 4 or more victims involved in that shooting, and that's when it actually is classified in the US as an active shooter incident. Anything below that, you don't really hear about, but it happens almost daily somewhere. All right, let's talk for a second about the most recent event that happened in Las Vegas, and I want you to think about a couple of things. What if you were Mandalay Bay? How would you have been able to respond to that? You couldn't have right at the moment, but how would you be able to respond afterwards? What would you need to do as that company or MGM that owns Mandalay Bay to be able to figure out how you're going to be able to, how should you be supporting some of the victims there or not? If you are, and I know that there were several casualties that were from Alberta, and if you were an employer and one of your staff were one of those victims, how would you be able to respond? Would you communicate to your team, to your public on that loss and what you were going to do to support the victim's family and their family members? I want to show you what happened after this. It wasn't just what happened and the horrible tragedy to the victims and everybody who was at that concert that night, as well as everybody around them, their families and friends, and how that's traumatizing them. But it re-triggered the folks in San Bernardino and in Orlando immediately. Because anytime there's an announcement of an active intruder incident, especially something as large as this, that has now overshadowed completely Orlando and San Bernardino, where each one of them at their time were recognized as the biggest terror attack or active shooter attack in America. We would never have known that just a year and a half later there would be 2 more since San Bernardino that would overshadow, make everybody forget about what happened in San Bernardino. But, so one of the triggers, Josh Garcia, and you see that third post there, you can't really read it, but it says that Josh Garcia was the manager of Orlando Pulse nightclub during the event when that shooting happened, which at the time was the biggest in America. There were 49 victims from that, and if you recall, it was a very different active shooter event where usually it's minutes and then they're gone. This time, that perpetrator was in the bar, in the club, for 4.5 hours, holding people hostage. Josh Garcia, instead of, as people were running out of his bar, he was running in to help save people. I had a chance, many hours to talk to Josh. We've become really good friends now, and I'm going to share a couple of insights that he shared with me for all of you as well. But that last post that Josh posted, I just wanted you to see. To those in Orlando feeling triggered right now, you are not alone. And then he provides the Orlando United Assistance Center telephone number that they've set up ever since the shooting occurred. So that may be something, if your community is faced with something like this, remember that it's not just about helping them heal and how they're going to deal with the trauma from that event. It may very well be every time another similar event happens, that's going to re-trigger them. And how are you going to be able to support them once those triggers happen? I'll take you back for a second to San Bernardino, and some of you might recall, but it's easy to forget because there have been so many other incidents happening since. But just to remember, back December 2nd, 2015, there was a group of county employees who were all public health inspectors in the county of San Bernardino. And they were having a Christmas party. They were at an off-site location, so it wasn't where they're normally working, but they do have several training sessions and different meetings where they have at this off-site location. So they were at this off-site location. It was a training session in the morning, and then they would have a lunch. And at the end of in the afternoon, they were going to have a Secret Santa exchange. Well, it ended up that they had their training in the morning, and one of their staff left at lunch. They all continued to enjoy their lunch. That staff person came back after lunch, opened the doors of a room similar to this, and was in black fatigues with an associate, his wife, and started shooting. And at first, nobody was aware that it was one of their colleagues, but it was the colleague that had left at lunch and had come back with weapons with the intent to kill his colleagues. As you can imagine, it was a horrific experience, and many in the room even recounting to me what they thought, and I want to share something with you. Because a lot of us seem to be under the impression that, especially in America, that if somebody comes in, well, if you've got a gun or if you've got something, that you're going to be able to take that person out before they can take anybody out, which is absolutely incorrect from what I've heard from the people who were in the room in Orlando as well as in San Bernardino, because your mind, when you're actually in that time and you're seeing someone come in, you're automatically, you want to talk yourself out of it, that it's not real, this can't be real. Several of the people that I talked to said, I just kept thinking, well, this is a stupid time to have a drill. Why would they decide to have a drill at our Christmas party? And then they just kept talking about it. And as people were being shot in front of them, their colleagues were falling in front of them with blood, they were still thinking, well, how come Julie didn't tell me there was going to be a drill and she was going to be part of it? They were still trying to talk themselves out of it. It took them several seconds before they realized what was really going on. And by that time, it was too late. For several of them, they didn't even have the time to think about hiding or think about running. I want to tell you a connection that Alberta has now with San Bernardino. And you probably recognize that sign. Fort McStrong was in front of the Canadian Tire after the Fort McMurray wildfires. But I wanted to show you the girl in the middle. Her name is Jessica, and she's one of the survivors who was in the room in San Bernardino that day. And now she volunteers with us with the volunteer that I mentioned and we travel around to help communities rebuild and give them messages that survivors are there to support other survivors and that everything's going to be okay. And so Jessica, for her first time ever in her life, flew from San Bernardino, California to Fort McMurray to help us help that community rebuild after the Fort Mac fires. So I wanted to throw that in there. There's a bunch of survivors, and this is another thing I want to share with you. I have a lot of information from survivors themselves, or people who've lost family members from terror attacks or active shooter attacks, and know that they all get together, the survivors themselves, to share lessons learned and how we can try to help communities to better plan for and prepare for. I want to point a couple of people out. The gentleman with the sunglasses standing up with the yellow star, that's Josh Garcia from the Orlando Pulse nightclub, the manager. The woman beside him with the sunglasses, she was shot 4 times in the room in San Bernardino, and she's now on her 5th surgery to be able to walk properly again, but she's healing very well, and she's an amazing hero survivor. The woman beside her, and the other sunglasses, well, we should have their sunglasses. The woman beside her lost her daughter in the 9/11 terror attacks, and she's now part of our volunteer team. Her name's Elsie. Beside me in the middle, but beside me in purple, that's Jess from San Bernardino as well. So this is us all assembling a year after the December attack to be able to share and support each other. We're very pain. Some San Bernardino lessons learned, this is specifically on communicating after that kind of crisis. First of all, the San Bernardino issue was also very different than your typical active shooter attack because it's classified technically not only as an active shooter, but also as a terror and also as a workplace violence issue. So you've got 3 different issues all rolled into one event, which has created some very unique challenges for the survivors and the victims' families of that attack. One of the widows, who I'll show you a picture of her because I believe she's in one of the pictures I have as well. One of the widows told me that her husband had gone to HR several times previous to the attack to complain about some odd behavior that their colleague was having, who ended up being the perpetrator. And unfortunately, you can't imagine how that wife feels after knowing that after several attempts to address the problem with HR, that supposedly there wasn't much done about it, and then in the end, a horrible tragedy occurred, including her husband himself being one of the first ones killed in the room. The incident was a work holiday party or training session, so it was at an off-site location, so even if you drilled and knew how to evacuate from your own office, this is a challenge because you're not in your office location, but you're still with your same office staff, so it is a challenge. Communicating with staff and family and community throughout the immediate and long-term recovery was key. There was a lot of failures in that area too. The company, the county, was not really very informative with the group, letting them know where to go, where to seek help, even being able to connect them back with their families to let people know that they were safe, and let others know that if they wanted to know if their other employees were safe or not. There were a lot of disconnects, but with any emergency, we notice it, and every exercising we notice, the biggest disconnect usually is communications. And that was the problem that was found throughout, and is still continuing to be a problem and a challenge for being able to address the needs of those survivors. Imagine if you were faced with a loss. Now here's a business continuity conundrum here. They now were faced with an immediate loss of 14 of their staff, of one department, gone, never come back again, let alone another 22 who were physically shot and injured, some of which, well, the woman I showed you the sunglasses, she didn't get out for 1 month. She was in the hospital for 1 month, the last one to leave, yet she still can't physically go to work because she's going through surgery after surgery, as some of them are. So think about, your whole team is gone, that's it. And you don't know if some of them are ever going to come back. They might start coming back after the year. Big challenge to think about. All right, let's talk about Pulse for a second, but I just want to share with you some guidance from Orlando and Josh. So of course everybody remembers what happened at Pulse nightclub that at the time then replaced San Bernardino as being, and this was only 6 months after San Bernardino occur. 49 people shot in that nightclub on that night. But this is Josh that I mentioned, and this is us just in New York during 9/11 week, because we were doing some volunteer work there just a few weeks ago. But he shared with me, I also want to share with you, people think about, and I get a lot of people asking me about how to use social media during a crisis, and when is it effective to do so, and when it is not. And one of the things I had asked Josh, because I was talking to another group about crisis communication specifically, is I said, what would be your first recommendation on whether or not we should use social media after an event like this, and how? And he said that the club, Pulse nightclub, effectively they went to Facebook and Twitter immediately to be able to warn people to stay away from the area. They couldn't, unfortunately, communicate with people that were in there because it's too late. But their focus was to try to be able to get the word out to their clientele and anybody else that might be around to stay away from the area. So he had said that was the most effective way for them to be able to communicate as quickly as possible to let everybody know to stay away. And then 2 weeks later, or was it 2 weeks later, or a few weeks later, of course, Edmonton happened. So Josh posted so many terrible things going on around the world, thinking about Edmonton, you are not alone. Love is stronger than hate. So there's another little connection from Orlando to Alberta to show support here as well. Now let's go to Vegas again for a second. We went, a team of us, not I, but a team of the volunteer group Stars of Hope and I then went to Vegas 4 days later with these hand-painted stars that looked like this, that were tainted by survivors of San Bernardino and Orlando, to be able to give as messages of love and support. And they would write hope or love, we believe and we're with you, love from Orlando, the survivors, and they signed them. And they went to Vegas 4 days after the shooting, and they handed them out. They hung them at the site. They hung them all around the city. They hung them by the Welcome to Las Vegas sign, and they delivered them to the heroes in the hospitals that helped save lives. And just to point out, there's Josh Garcia from Orlando in purple, and then the woman at the end, that's the woman that I mentioned who was the widow, who mentioned that her husband had lodged those complaints, and her husband unfortunately lost his life that day in San Bernardino. And that's Jessica from San Bernardino, who had come to Fort McMurray. There she is there. And another little connection, we also have stars going to Vegas from Alberta as of yesterday, because I came in early to be able to go to a school called Footprints for Learning. And has anybody heard of this school? Cool, so a bunch of students painted stars yesterday with me, and we're going to be sending them to Las Vegas on behalf of here, of this community. And you might recognize that dude who's kind of responsible for helping me set it up. Where is he? Right there. So that's us before paint and ready. So I just wanted to mention that. So thank you to Erin, and just to a little glimpse on what really happens with survivors, and to show how strong we really are, we're resilient as people. These people went through something that I could possibly never even imagine going through, and what witnessing what they went through, yet they want to be able to share what happened and help comfort and prepare others in case they experience the same thing. Okay, so now we're going to get into the learning part of this, which I thought the best way to go through how to be prepared for an active shooter attack would be through the 4 phases of emergency management. So I'm going to take you through each phase and what you should be considering if you haven't already, based on each phase of emergency management. So the mitigation phase, perform a risk assessment. I won't read everything, but hopefully everybody can read it all right. Another quick tip, for those of you who are taking notes, you might want to also take a picture of the slides. That's sometimes easier too, if you're able to. So mitigation phase, perform a risk assessment. How safe is your location right now? Are there areas that you can enhance safety or security? If so, do you have the funds to be able to do it, or what's feasible and manageable to be able to do so? Do you have security plans in place so they've been revised and reviewed regularly? And I would definitely emphasize to have a crisis communications plan. And not just like an active shooter crisis communications plan. I'm talking about an overall organizational crisis communications plan so that you know how to effectively be able to communicate to anybody at any time during any kind of event. That is so, so key, because every time one of these critical incidents happen, this is what is the biggest challenge that comes out every time, is the lack of communicating efficiently and as quickly as possible. It'll help you be able to do that if you've got some kind of plan that you can pull out at the time of the crisis that already identifies who's supposed to be doing what, and maybe have some draft templates in there so that you're not just working from scratch. So here's some other considerations on mitigation. Does anybody have any examples of what they currently use that they would define as mitigation methods right now to ensure that controlled access to where your work is right now? Can anybody think of anything? They've got locks in certain areas, and you've got key controls or anything. But you can think of some of the things perhaps that if you thought that you needed to secure your area, what you might be able to do, what might or may not make sense. It all depends on where your location is. Okay, we're going into the preparedness phase now, which is our key phase, having an emergency plan in place. And I'm sure hopefully every one of you has some kind of an emergency plan in place that defines how you are going to deal with any kind of crisis when it happens. So make sure you've got that emergency plan. I'm not telling anybody that you have to have an active intruder plan. If you've got a good emergency plan or a crisis management plan with a crisis communications plan attached to it, that should help you deal with whatever the situation is. And then I'll give you some other things to keep in mind that you might want to include into your current plan to be able to ensure you can respond to an active intruder kind of scenario. Drills. We'll talk a bit about drills. Raising awareness, and that's key. Raising awareness, letting your staff know that you've got a plan in place. Look, if this stuff could happen, let's make sure that you know what to do if it does happen. Show them a video. There's a couple of good videos out there. The University of Alberta has one of them. Sit down with them, show them a video, raise awareness of the run, hide, fight concept, or however you want to define it, and we'll go through that as well. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about having some kind of an emergency notification system, and I'll give you an example of a university who didn't have one, and how that failed, and how they chose to communicate, and now they realized that they need to have a notification system, some kind of a notification system in place. So preparedness, have a plan, consider physical security measures if it's feasible for you, ensure your facility has at least 2 evacuation routes, a main and an alternate, post and mark your evacuation routes in obvious locations throughout the building. And this is part of then your awareness session with your staff as well. It's great to post all this stuff and do all of this stuff, but they don't know where it is, or they haven't been walked through it. If something happens, it might not be useful for them because they won't remember where it is. So that's also the importance of having a drill, and that's different than an exercise. You should have a tabletop exercise as well with your key team to walk them through what could happen, and they go through the plans. But you should also have physical drills, and you don't have to have, people coming in uniform with guns and all of that stuff. But at least talking through and then walking people through the evacuation routes so that they're familiar with that physical walk. Because we all become more familiar and remember things if we've already gone through them physically instead of just talked about them. When pre-selecting or think about some shelter-in-place locations that you might want to pre-identify with people, that if something happens in this area, you're going to all go to this area or vice versa. And that if you've got a locked area, that you can let everybody know we're running inside here if we have to shelter in place and there's no way for us to leave the building. So some of the things to include in your plan: your preferred method of reporting an incident, having an evacuation policy and procedure and making sure your staff know about it, those emergency escape procedures and routes, having floor plans and safe areas identified in advance, have the roles and responsibilities and contact information for your emergency management team. That should already be in the plan anyway. And contact information for first responders in local hospitals, and an emergency notification system. And that could be, for a small team, it could really mean just a call tree list and all the different methods of how to communicate with people, or it could be a fancy notification system, depending on your needs and the size of your organization and who you are. So I'll give you an example. Some of you might have heard of this last year. A university in Newfoundland had been alerted that there was a potential active intruder, potential armed intruder on campus. So they had decided that any messaging that they were going to shoot up to people was going to be through Twitter. So unfortunately, the first tweet, the first and only communication that they put out was this. It was one tweet that unless you're actually checking your Twitter feed at the time, luckily one of the students who was in class happened to be checking his Twitter feed, and then this popped up. And then he asked the teacher and asked around and alerted people about it. But even this, if you read this message, it doesn't really sound clear, does it? It doesn't tell you what's going on to state what you should be doing. So it was very vague and unclear. If anything, all it's doing is making people panic now, because what's going on? What am I supposed to do? What are my friends supposed to do? What's going on? So this has created more challenges than anything, and it wasn't too helpful. But fortunately, they realized that mistake and tweeted out afterwards that they needed to do a better job. And now they're looking at other ways. I believe they've got a notification system in place now since that event. But they did realize that that was a challenge and a failure that they made. Some other plan considerations: actions for people with disabilities. Do you have people with disabilities, functional needs, visual needs, that may need some extra support, and you might have to include that in your plan? Guest and visitor considerations. So it may be great that your staff are all trained and know where to go, but do you have regular clients coming into your area? If so, are you going to enact some kind of a policy to make them aware of where the exit routes are, just in case something happens? It may not make sense, it may, but just something to consider. Does it contain bilingual language, depending on the community that you're in and the clients that you serve? Okay, more preparedness. Conduct physical drills, and I talked about this with all employees and the importance of doing that so that people can remember where they're supposed to go. You might want to also, if you are able to do a large-scale actual drill, involve your local law enforcement, who normally are really, they're great at wanting to come in and be able to work with companies to do that kind of thing. Remember to let everyone know in advance, though, around your area, that this is going to happen, because you don't want that to actually become a crisis in itself. And then all of a sudden you've got the SWAT team coming in, you've got media coming in because they think it's a real event. So remind people and let them know ahead of time that there's going to be a drill going on. Have typical tabletop exercises, like I mentioned, with your executive team, so that they're familiar with that type of a scenario going on. And they know how to respond, and they can go in and talk about their plans and who will be doing what. That's really important too. More preparedness, the staff awareness and training. Some ideas: having those annual drills, telling them where to evacuate regularly, having assembly points identified ahead of time and letting the staff know where those assembly points are if they're needed in the future. Notification and communication procedures that we talked about. And enforcing and reinforcing those good safety practices to hopefully help prevent the bad people from coming in to your environment. Like with secure doors, you don't have, or cell phones on silent. Okay, here's an issue that I'm going to talk about for a second. Because you'll hear about this a lot, where we remind people that if you're in the middle of an active intruder incident, silence your cell phone, because otherwise that could be a clue, and it has been proven that that was a way for the Orlando perpetrator to be able to find and identify where victims were hiding, because he was hearing their cell phone. So it's even on vibrate, you can hear that vibration, right? But the problem with that is, in reality, you're not thinking about that, and don't even have time to be reaching for your phone, to be able to silence your phone when someone's coming in the room. So this is actually advice for people who are not in, because unfortunately it's too late for those who are in the room. And most of the time, like I said, people were still taking 7 seconds to walk through that this wasn't even real. So they didn't have time to think about turning their cell phones off. Some people, I've recommended that they think about if it makes sense for them, have a policy in place where in the workplace everybody just automatically, when you're there, it's just a daily thing that you turn off, or not turn off, but silence your phone. And then that way, if something actually happens, the phone is already silenced, so they don't have to think about it during an actual event. It may make sense for some areas, it may not make sense for other businesses, it depends, but just something to think about. We talked about thinking about people with different access needs and making sure that you factor those into your plan as well, and how they would evacuate in that kind of emergency. Do you have the capabilities to support them evacuating? Having emergency kits in accessible locations throughout your building with what I mentioned here that you should at least have: radios, floor plans. Oh, here's a tip as well regarding radios. Has anybody heard of Zello before? Yes. So Zello just really became popular. It's been around for a couple of years. It became really popular after Hurricane Harvey response, where the Cajun Navy ended up using it. It's an app, a free app that you can download on your phone called Zello, Z-E-L-L-O. You can download it and use it basically as a walkie-talkie. And whoever else we've got listed under there, you can communicate that way. When the 911 signals went down in the Texas area, that's what the Cajun Navy used to be able to coordinate and be able to respond and rescue people. It's an incredible app, and all of my colleagues that have been dealing with the hurricanes down there keep talking about it and recommending it, and wanted me to share with all of you to check out this Zello app. Radios, floor plans, have an employee roster and contact numbers, first aid kits, flashlights. We talked about conducting a manual drill, and here's some of the things that you should also remember, because one of the things that keeps being mentioned is, when I would be talking to people who've gone through this, is they weren't aware at first that it was gunshots. We even heard that in Las Vegas, right? That it took a while, people thought it was fireworks, and it's really different. Gunshots don't sound the same as I'm sure some of you in the room might have experienced before. When you hear the sound of gunshots, it doesn't sound like what we hear in the movies. It's very different. So there are videos online that tell you what to hear, like what to look for as far as sounds, or what to listen for. So that's something that I would recommend that we talk to our staff about, is how to recognize the sound of gunshots and reacting quickly when gunshots occur and what they're going to do. So the training should cover running, hiding, or fighting, depending on what you can do, calling 911 when it's safe to do so, and how to react when law enforcement arrives. So now let's go right into the response phase. Response phase. If and when somebody finds out there's somebody on site that's a trespasser, that could be someone that might be injuring people, immediate notification of first responders, because they're the ones obviously who are going to come in and then find and take down the perpetrator. In the meantime, after you've called 911, you're taking emergency actions and enacting those plans you've already got in place, and making sure you're contacting people to let them know where they're supposed to go. Are you sheltering in place somewhere? Are you assembling somewhere? Are you evacuating the building? Are you sending messages out to clients and other people to stay away from the building because there's an incident going on? Work with the first responders once they get there, and account for all individuals. Determine how you're going to notify families that this event has happened, and assess the needs. So more about calling 911 when it's safe to do so. This is the stuff that you need to tell your staff, that if they're in this kind of a situation, this is the kind of information that the police will be looking for from them if they can provide that information. The role of law enforcement, I think most of you are probably familiar. Do we have any law enforcement people in the room today? But there you go. Do you want to talk about the role of law enforcement in a nutshell at all in this kind of a situation?
No.
Okay. Well, basically, the bottom line is it's law enforcement role to go in, and their main focus is to find the perpetrator and to take down that perpetrator and to remove the threat.
Locate, isolate, stop the threat.
There you go. Sorry, can you say that louder?
Locate, isolate, stop the threats.
There. And one of their responsibilities is not to go in and as they find injured people, to help the injured people, because they're looking to stop the perpetrator from continuing on and hurting more. So it's EMS and others who will be coming in as well to be able to help the victims. So the other first responders will be coming in, and they're the ones that will be tending to those who've been injured. They may also request able-bodied individuals who may be around, so your staff may be requested as well to help if they're asked to. Okay, so now let's get into the concept of run, hide, and fight. And there's other terminology out there now, and some people don't really like the terminology of run, hide, fight. Department of Homeland Security in the US still promotes the concept of run, hide, fight. Just a few weeks ago, I heard this amazing presentation by an FBI detective in New York who's responded to a multitude of active shooter incidents, and he still swears by the most important thing that we need to do if we can is to encourage and remind people to try to distance themselves as far as possible from the perpetrator. So it still is, if you can, try to run in the opposite direction. If you cannot, then try to hide in an area the perpetrator may not be able to find you. And if you can't do that, then the last worst case scenario is to be able to try to prevent the perpetrator from doing more harm. But that's worse than the last case scenario, and it may not be feasible for everybody depending on the situation. But this is still what is being trained by government professionals. University of Alberta has a wonderful, for those of you who don't or are not already aware of this video, it's something that I would recommend that you check out and maybe look at potentially having your staff have an awareness session with them and go through this video. Okay, let's go into run. DHS also has on YouTube, they have a good run, hide, fight video that you can actually, if you just put in run, hide, fight, DHS, it'll be the first one that comes up. And that might be a really good one as well to be able to show if you're going to have some kind of staff awareness training session. So run. Warn individuals to enter an area where the active shooter could be, or not to enter, sorry. Have an escape route plan in mind, and hopefully you've already thought of that ahead of time. So if you know where the perpetrator is, you know that you're going to go use that other escape route that you already decided on. Evacuate, regardless of what others agree to follow, and that's something that you should be saying in those awareness sessions, is if someone doesn't want to go, you can't wait for them. Everybody should be trained to just get up and not to start gathering up your things. Just go yourself. Leave your laptop, everything else behind. And help others escape only if it's possible and safe to do so. Run, more tips. Prevent individuals from entering an area. Keep your hands visible. Why do you keep your hands visible when you're going to run out of the room? Law enforcement representative. Why is that important to remember you do that?
So you're not to recognize you as a victim as opposed to an offender.
That's right, yeah. So that's, and you'll see that in the videos as well, in the training videos, they'll demonstrate how to do that too. So that's a kind of an important thing to raise awareness of your staff and something to do and things to do when they're in that situation. Follow instructions. Police officers, of course, don't attempt to move wounded people by yourself until the trained personnel come in to do that, and call 911 when it's safe to do so. Hide. So your second action, if you don't have the time to be able to run, or you have nowhere to run to, like in San Bernardino, where they did not. They were basically trapped in a room a little bit bigger than this, and they really didn't have anywhere to run. There was one small door where two people were able to run out. Otherwise, everybody else had, and their last option was to hide under the tables like this instead. There really wasn't any really viable options of where to hide. Unfortunately, the perpetrator knew the exact layout of the room because he had been there several times before, including that morning. So he knew what to expect and how the room was laid out. So for them, they didn't really have a great chance of being able to get out in time. But if you're able to hide, think of where would be the most appropriate hiding places. So would it be, if a perpetrator came in from that door, and I thought, well, I'm going to hide right here, would that make sense? Well, in this room, Maybe, maybe not. It depends. So think about where the perpetrator might not be able to see you. Also, stay away from windows, areas where the perpetrator's coming in and he might not be in the room yet, but he can see people there. One of the best places to hide, they recommend, if you're in, so first of all, you want to try to find a place that you can lock. And also, once you've locked the door, make sure that you try to put large furniture or anything you can to block the door to try to prevent the perpetrator from coming through. Another piece of advice is if you're hiding and you know you've got an active shooter at the other side of the door, is to hide at the bottom. Here, let me give you an example. Let's say this is the door, you're here, the perpetrator's on this side, and you're here. The best place to hide is lowest to the ground, right stuck to the door at the bottom. Because normally if the perpetrator is going to shoot through the door, he's not going to shoot down at the bottom. He's going to shoot from his or her firing range, which will be more at this level instead of down here. Of course, some ideas on how to prevent an active shooter from coming in. Silence your cell phone bit, but again, as I've learned, it might be too late before people remember to do that. And now, worst case scenario, you haven't been able to run, and you haven't been able to hide, then worst case and last case scenario would be to fight. Not individually, but as a group. Preferably because you're obviously stronger as a group against that one or two perpetrators that are behind the door or in the room. So think about what you might be able to do to take down that aggressor. I'm not going to suggest certain ways, but in the videos they show you different ways and you can do that as well. But think about how as a group would be the most effective way. And it might be that you're going to have to try to look around the room and see what's the heaviest thing that you might want to be able to just throw at the perpetrator. Or whatever makes sense in your room. So I can't really tell you right now, but let's think about in this room. If somebody came in right now and we couldn't hide anywhere, we couldn't run anywhere, we decided as a group that we were going to try to stop that perpetrator. How would we do that? Just something to think about. We'll do a little activity in a second about that, but think about how we would do that. What we would take? Would we take a table and try to throw it at them? What would we do? All right, so in review, first choice is to run if you can and you have time to. Or hide if you haven't been able to run. And last case scenario is fight as a team if you're able to. Yeah.
On your first slide, hide, or run. It says something about evacuate the other group members and then something I couldn't understand.
You mean go even if others choose to stay behind?
Oh, there's another.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Because there's been cases where people just, they don't want to leave their colleagues behind, so they're not sure what to do. But in the end, yes, you want everybody to go, and if it's safe to try to force people to leave with you, but you want to make sure that as many people as possible are leaving, even if some chose to stay behind.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
You have this group for like the able-bodied person. How do you change this for a senior population or children, our children? You can't necessarily run and there's no place to hide. You're kind of there.
Right.
How do you change this to incorporate those groups?
Right. Sorry, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, so there's special devices that you can buy that lock down rooms for you, so that can't open for classroom situations. Little things that slide under the door that you can't open the door. So in that case, work on your lockdown procedures and work on how to hide your personnel so that they're not being attacked. So lock doors, whatever it is, some sort of mechanism that you can barricade yourself, turn off the lights away from windows, like you're saying, and hide in place. That's not
Thank you. Okay. Just quickly, and it's not really an activity, but just for us to think again. And I've been asking you to think a lot, but let's think again. Look around the room we're in right now, and what would we do in an active situation? What would you choose to do? And we don't have to talk about it out loud, but just think for a couple of minutes. Take a look at this room, and let's say the perpetrator came from those doors. What would you choose to do personally? Think about it. So does anybody want to yell out some of the things that they thought about that they would think to do? Yeah.
Whoever wants to join us, there's going to that small, like, lock the door.
Right. Good idea. Yeah. Anybody else have some ideas of what they would do immediately if that happened? Okay, so you're saying separate into two groups so that potentially, well, unfortunately, there might be one group that's targeted and the other is saved because of that. But I mean, it all depends on the group, where you are, what the room's like, what the escape routes are like, what the hiding options are. Yeah.
You hope that law enforcement came with the guns.
The thing with all this stuff is they're over with it by now. They're over long before police show up.
Yeah. Normally. Yeah.
In most cases.
Yeah, the average is 4 minutes, I think. Yeah.
And they always pick a location that's lots of target and no weapons. Even the 4-foot one, people go, as if it's a military base. They're not armed, right? So, well, yeah, they don't. It's not like you walk into a police station and do this. It's easy targets with where they've got time to carry out their plan and then off. So.
Yeah. So just a recap of some of the suggested actions, which a lot of you mentioned already and we've been talking about throughout the presentation. Now let's get into recovery, because this is really, really important. And this is what I've learned by working directly with the survivors and the victims' families in San Bernardino and Orlando, is we need to make sure that we've got plans in place to support recovery of these individuals and their families after something like this happens, because it's different than our regular crisis event that we normally plan for and that our crisis plans usually look at and can support. But this is long-term recovery. People are not going to get over this next month. Or you can't even tell when someone, if they're going to ever get over it and be able to come back to work and work effectively or not. So it's important for us to have recovery plans in place to make sure that we can deal with people throughout the recovery process, whether they're survivors, your staff that have been involved in an incident, or it's family members of your staff who perished from that incident. Very important to think about that. The immediate needs, what they're going to need in support to help them recover mentally and physically. A lot of the survivors that were in the room in Orlando, or in San Bernardino were not injured. A lot of them were. There were about 70 some people in the room. 22 were injured, 14 were killed. But all the others, they were injured as well mentally. And so that was something that was forgotten by their leadership team, was to remind them and make sure that they had access to mental health professionals to help support them. Because even though they weren't physically injured, they definitely are traumatized and need to have support to be able to then function properly, to go back to work and do their roles. Let's talk about business continuity and recovery for a second as well, because that was a big challenge in San Bernardino too, I mentioned. But all of a sudden now they've got 14 staff that are gone, never coming back. Their work is just sitting there now. There's nobody else to do that work. 22 others who at least are gone for several months, so they can't do the work. It ended up that several people who did go back to work a couple months later, well, nobody was doing their work, so they come back to a hot desk with a pile of work that, first of all, they've just been through something that you can't even imagine going through. And then you get sent to work, you've got this big pile of work that's sitting there that's been compiling for the past couple of months. And that's just increasing their stress now. And now, one instance where a person came in and worked in San Bernardino after that, they thought they were okay, they go in for half day, they see they've got this huge pile accumulated, nobody took care of passing those jobs off to other people, went back on leave again. Business recovery, and business continuity as well, is if you can't support your staff to be able to recover correctly and make sure that they're able to not be triggered when they come back to work, or know how to deal with those triggers to make them still be comfortable coming back to work, then you're going to have to look at trying to either support people to recover, or you're going to have to look at other alternatives then instead. But ideally, what you'd like to do is to support your employees to make sure that they're at a point where they're able to come back. And that's going to help them just as well as it's going to help your organization too. They want to go back to work. These people in San Bernardino want to go back to work. It's just that there have been so many challenges that they've been going through because some of these things weren't taken into consideration, that most of them are still not back to work. And some of them, I can guarantee you, are never going to go back to work, no matter how much therapy and assistance they're getting. But some of them, unfortunately, even up to a year after the event, were still not advised to or given access to by their employer mental health needs, a mental health professional, which is completely unacceptable. Oh, and then business recovery. When are people going to return to work? You don't know. That's a challenge. You can't say, okay, well, you're off for 3 weeks, and then everybody should be good in a month. People are going to recover really quickly. Some others are never going to recover, and it depends. So it's really a progressive thing, and that's a challenge. And you don't really have a plan for that. You can't plan for that. But it's something to be aware of, that it's a completely different resource challenge now. And also, when you tell people, okay, well, we're going to open back, or maybe you can come back in half-day sessions, and then see how that works for you. Maybe looking at if it's feasible for that position for them to do remote work instead of coming into the office, if that helps them physically, if they've had any injuries, or if it helps them emotionally, because going back into the office is going to trigger them. One of the San Bernardino survivors, her therapist had told her and identified that going back to work was definitely a trigger for her. So she had asked the employer if they could make accommodations for her to be able to do remote work, and she was denied. So, yeah, unfortunately, that was just one of the challenges that the San Bernardino survivors are still going through. Another challenge is that it's a workplace violence issue. So they have to go through workers' compensation, and that's been proving to be very, very challenging, where still to this day, they are getting denials of treatment, with denials of medication, denials of surgeries, which is increasing their stress as well. Every time you get, or you're thinking, you're applying in, I hope this third surgery goes through to help me walk, but I don't know if it will. Imagine the added stress that's putting onto these survivors. Some things to consider: where you're going to shelter staff following an active shooter incident, immediate long-term grief, counseling, and support for survivors, as well as the other employees that may not have been in the room that day. But they may have lost their colleagues that worked right beside them. They're going to go through trauma too, even if they weren't in the room or in the area or at the incident that day. So think about them as well. Media management and crisis communications, there were a lot of failures there too. One of the challenges with the survivors from San Bernardino was they were in a room afterwards. They were segregated in a room after the incident happened for several hours, not told anything, not told who had died, who had lived, and then they get out, and there wasn't security around to be able to keep the media away. So as soon as they leave this room, there are throngs of media and cameras in their face afterwards asking them, did you know the perpetrator? Did you know that it was one of your staff members? And did you know that blah, blah, blah died? And nobody knew anything because they had not known anything. They didn't know the media, were not warned the media would be out there. So that was really traumatizing for them as well. It shouldn't have happened. There should have been some way to prevent them from being accessible to the media immediately before they were told what was going on. Some more things to consider. Well, if there's fatalities, there are going to be different ways that you're going to have to deal with that. There's going to be short and long-term injuries. The whole return to work aspect that I mentioned. Support to victims' family members as well. And remember those triggering events. So after the 1 year, there's usually triggers after 2 months, after 6 months, and then the 1 year anniversary is huge. That's a huge trigger. And then every time another active shooter incident happens, that's going to trigger as well. Or it doesn't have to be an active intruder incident. If your incident is somebody stabbed somebody with a pair of scissors in the office, then anytime someone hears of a similar office attack, that's going to trigger that memory of what they saw and experienced. Some valuable resources for you before we end this. There's a guide called Psychological First Aid, and it's created by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. You can find it on their website. It's located at the bottom. It's by a colleague who's an amazing, amazing trauma psychotherapist that worked with the Manchester Police Department for 10 years, and now she's got her own practice in the UK. But she wrote this wonderful book on how to plan for and recover from office workplace violence attacks and trauma at work. Other resources that you can find online. There's a desk reference guide from the Department of Homeland Security that you can find. Pocket-sized reference card that you can print out. An active shooter poster. There's many resources that you can find from them. So that's on the DHS website. And then I think that's our time. I won't go through this. I mentioned the stars to you. I showed it to you. I wanted to show you a couple of other ones where in San Bernardino, again, remember we talked about the Quebec shooting that happened at the mosque. And right after that happened, I planted a star. And because I knew I was going back to San Bernardino to meet with the San Bernardino survivors again, and all the San Bernardino survivors, not all of them, some of them, signed that star, brought it back to Canada, and delivered it to Quebec City to support them in their recovery. So, in summary, and this is just an example of another recovery method that's helping. It doesn't cost much money, but it's just painting stars for people to help remind them that people are caring about them and delivering them. So know that if something happens to you here or in your office, that these stars will be coming to you from Orlando, in San Bernardino, in Vegas, and the next area where an active intruder attack happens. And it's unbelievable to see how this helps. A little piece of wood can help the community heal. We've had invitations to meet with mayors from San Bernardino, Baton Rouge, after we went and brought stars to the police officers who died in the Baton Rouge police shootings last year. It's unbelievable to see how there are now new and creative ways to be able to help communities recover in these tragic situations. All right, summary. Mitigate your risks, have a plan, exercise the plan, train your staff with annual drills, work with your first responders, establish and test notification systems and procedures, consider both short and long-term recovery for something like this. Evaluate, refine, and enhance your current plans and procedures so you don't need to develop a whole active shooter plan, but just take a look at what your plans are right now and see if these kinds of considerations would fall in there or not. And preparedness is key. You want to be able to try to educate people ahead of time so that they at least know what to do or remember what they're supposed to do if they're facing something. And I'm here to help. If I can help anybody at all, enhancing your plans or running exercises or anything, just reach out to me and let me know. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but maybe afterwards, because I think my time is done now, right?